Okay, well, this is emotions. This is kind of a 2 unit or 2 month thing we're going to do. The first part is just on understanding emotions, and then we're going to go deeper into how those emotions affect the narratives that affect all elements of our life. It's pretty crucial in order to understand emotions, in order to understand mental health. They interplay massively. So not much else to say other than, as you can see at the bottom there, I'm pointing out that we're not generally good at them. Humans struggle with being able to both manage emotions and identify emotions. There's an interesting stat that points out that, in fact, if you give most North Americans at an adult age 30 seconds to name as many emotions as they can, most will name three. Wonder if you can guess what they are. Pause for a second. If you guessed some version of happy, mad, and sad, or angry, instead of mad, you're right. Those are the three we most generally say. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, everybody, this is just a really important slide to go back over because it's going to take two important things from what we did with the brain in the first unit and just re-highlight them so make sure we're aware of it for when we go through this week's information. So the first one is just understanding again the three parts to the brain, and you might remember we've got the reptilian. We talked about having that as the thumb, and then you've got the limbic over top, and then you've got the thinking or cognitive part of the brain that goes over top of that. Our reptilian is the most designed for survival. Our limbic is the one that handles emotions and handles fear, fight, flight, freeze, that sort of thing. It's the one that kind of hijacks we spoke about when the thinking or cognitive brain is no longer able to recognize potential survival challenges. And we also spoke about how potential survival challenges have changed a lot. We don't have bears coming in the classroom anymore, but we still have threats that we perceive. And so the limbic takes over. Now, you might have already kind of thought about this or put this together, but it's that limbic that lives and takes over. If it does that too often and we can't get out of passing control back from our limbic into our thinking cognitive brain, that's what creates anxiety disorders. I mean, it's a bit more to it, but essentially that place of being stuck in a limbically controlled environment is going to tax and tax our body and our mind to a point that it's really going to overwhelm us and it's going to be difficult to be able to function in day-to-day life like that. So often we find that people with anxiety disorders really struggle to get out of limbically controlled thinking, which is a lot about what we're going to be talking about this month and next month. So that's the key part there. You can see the lobes that are part of the cognitive brain on the outside in the picture, and you can see the limbic and reptilian is more towards the middle there and down the brain stem. We haven't met Dr. Boyd yet, but one thing that we might talk about is if she does come to our class is about this idea of chronic stress, which is again linked to the limbic being in control too much. There's a hormone, cortisol, that runs through and it regulates a lot of elements of our body, and like sleep cycles and eating and things like this. And we know that in order to break down cortisol and to be able to regulate our emotional well-being, our manage our digestion, and also to manage our sleep, we need to break down cortisol. And people who live in chronic stress, where they're not getting out of the limbic system, are not able to do that nearly as easily. And this is what often causes chronic stress. The other thing that I want to just point out here is the four B's, and this is just a reminder because they're going to show up a lot in what we're doing today. So the first one being biology. This is what we take from our genetic parents. Biography. These are the stories that we tell ourselves. We'll use the word narratives a lot. That'll be coming up over various months, so be ready for that one. But the narratives are the stories that we tell ourselves. The behaviors are the go-to things that we do when things are happening to us. You might have noticed, as I mentioned in class last time, some people respond to stresses or they respond to life events very differently than someone else who's going through something similarly. And that's because we have different behaviors that we've learned from people around us, often our upbringing, but also from other significant people in our lives, not just our parents. And those are the things that we go to and we get in patterns of. And then the final is backstory, which is essentially everything is a timeline that's happened to us from birth. Some of those things might even be things that we don't actually remember. They might be age 0 to 6, and you don't have much memory at all from 0 to 6, but they could be framing how we understand and make sense of the world around us, even pre-verbal. Okay, let's move on. Not much to say here. We will do this in class activity. Okay, so on this slide, I just really want to bring in the first of a number of therapeutic tools that we'll talk about in this class, especially in later months where we talk specifically about probably four different therapy techniques or therapy schools of therapy, I'll say. So the first one that we want to talk about and is big on understanding thought and emotion is cognitive behavioral therapy. You can see the picture on the left of the bowl of soup, the chicken noodle soup, and this is supposed to basically, you can tell me if my picture's any good. This is basically supposed to demonstrate the idea that emotions can sometimes feel like chicken noodle soup. There's a lot going on. It's difficult to separate. It's difficult to really pinpoint exactly what's happening. We love as human beings, it's just one of the things that we love to do is to put things into boxes and say, this is this. This happened because of this. This will be the thing that happens because I know this. We love to assume that everything is just kind of one thing leads to the next. It's very straightforward. It's very linear, it's very understandable. We like that. But in reality, it's not always like that. And in fact, it's usually not like that. Cognitive behavioral therapy tries to take a stab at making it a little bit easier to understand these things. So it uses, if you look at them on the right there, this behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. And there's a circle that goes between all of them. And basically what it says is that we have thoughts. Everyone has thoughts. You can't stop thoughts. Right? That's why I think they put thoughts on the top. That's why I like to have thoughts on the top in the pictures I've seen. Thoughts always happen. We can't stop thoughts. Don't think about a spider. You just thought about a spider. We can't stop our brain from having thoughts, right? Now, thoughts become feelings, and this is where, going back to what our 4B says, this is where some of um, our narratives, this is where some of our biography takes those thoughts and turns it into feelings. Some people will have thoughts of joy, or sorry, some people have thoughts of, let me back that up. People have thoughts of um, being at an ice rink, for example, and the feeling is joy. It reminds them of things in their childhood that they did with their parents, for example, where they would skate around and chase their older brother or something. Other people will remember an ice rink, and the feeling will come to them is pain because the first time and only time they ever went on an ice rink, they fell and smacked their head. They weren't wearing a helmet and they got a concussion. Now, these are pretty extreme examples, but you can get the idea how different thoughts can lead to different feelings. Now, the power in cognitive behavioral therapy, and one of the things it tries to do, is to help people understand different ways to see things and not to think of things just as being one thing or another, trying to get more of that middle ground, if you will. So you're not just, it's the worst thing when I step on the ice or the best thing I step on the ice. And then from feelings to behaviors, and behaviors are going to be how we respond to the world and what we do with that information. So we have the thought, a corresponding feeling comes out. What is the behavior that comes from that? And then how does that behavior and the green arrow feed back to our thoughts? Right? Those behaviors are going to link to Brene Brown's go-to behaviors as well. But cognitive behavioral therapy mostly focuses on the green circle, not exclusively by any stretch, but mostly on the green circle, and says, how can we adjust the behaviors that I have to make sure that the behaviors that I'm exhibiting from the feelings I have are helpful? And this is the word I like to use. They're not good, they're not bad, they're helpful. What is somebody's goal, for example? Let's say, using our ice rink example, let's say that my goal is to be able to step back on the ice rink after having the first time at age 6 be a concussion. I'm now 10 years old, for example, and my goal is to be able to step back on that ice rink. I need to help think about what my feelings are, and I need to help put those into a more helpful place so that I can take behaviors that'll get me back on the ice. I hope this kind of explains a little bit about how the interplay of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors go and how one feeds the next. As you can see, the circle just kind of goes forever. And that's because we're building up from last month these synapses that are going to really impact how we understand and continue to understand and how we future think about the world around us. If we don't actively and cognitively think about our feelings and our behaviors, then our thoughts just run amok and we get into patterns of doing the same thing and over again. Sometimes that can be helpful, but often it isn't. So one thing that we're going to take from Brene, she's got a book I'll bring to class and we'll share here, that I think is quite helpful, is to understand um, that the emotions that we feel are not just good or bad, but there is a much more complexity and there are layers to these. And so she groups them in places that instead of just being like, these are the ones you'd really like to feel, or these are the ones you feel when they're kind of like being sad. They're not grouped like that. The way she groups emotions that I think is much more helpful, and we'll use this in class, is to think about what is our experience. So Sheath says, for example, one grouping of emotions is things are uncertain. You can take a second and think about what sort of things you think might fall under that. Or another one, when we fall short, right? You might, for example, go like, okay, maybe disappointment is in there, right? But what other things might be in there as well, right? So you can see all of them on there. We'll explore this a little bit in class, so I won't go over it too much right now. But again, the key thing to take away is that emotions are not just good or bad, that they fit into a bigger picture of understanding, and they can be grouped and understood with things that might seem different. One of the things we'll talk about is it's not just important to understand what emotion is being expressed, but also the intensity of the emotion and the reason behind the emotion. My favorite example, for example, and I'll just wrap up with this here, is to say that um, love and hate are actually very similar emotions in many ways. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And you know this already. Intrinsically, you know this. And I'll give you a very quick example, which is just to say you can love and hate your parents, but somebody you've never seen on the road, you have indifference to. You walk by them on the sidewalk and you have indifference to them, right? So remember, love and hate are similar emotions. And so we shouldn't always think about things as being opposites based on being either we want them or we don't. Okay. Nothing really to say here. We'll probably do an activity that uses these, but you don't need to worry about them right now. Or you can read them if you like them. They're some of my favorite quotes. Okay, and this will probably also be something related to what we'll do with a group activity, but you don't need to worry about it right now. Okay, now this is a really interesting thing that we got from a presenter we had a few years ago, and I screen captured it because I loved it so much. I'll ask a couple questions about this in class, but as you can basically see, you have a number of people, and they used body scan imagery to be able to find the temperatures of people in their bodies as they were experiencing emotions. Now, it's going to look quite extreme in the pictures, and in reality, our bodies don't necessarily change nearly as much as the pictures might indicate that they do there. But there are differences, and as you'll see, they can be quite different from each other. So red is going to be the most intense of the or sorry, I should say yellow actually in this example is the most intense, the highest heat, and then into red, and then down into purple and blue. And so you can see, for example, depression has really low, um, really low temperature, and you can see that happiness has very high temperature. And you can think a little bit about why that is. I will say there's a bit more to the difference between happiness and depression, but we'll talk about that in class. And we'll talk about this when we go through it together as well. Okay, so one of the things that we know about people generally, and I kind of alluded to this at the very top of the PowerPoint, is that we are not great at naming emotions. And your inability to come up with more than three on a piece of paper when given 30 seconds might feel a little silly and you might feel a little dumb, whatever else. But the practical application of this is much bigger. And so Brene talks about this, and many other people talk about it as well. But essentially, if you want to be able to express and understand how you're feeling, if you want to then take that information and you want to be able to use that in helpful ways to be able to inform future decisions, future ways of managing relationships, future ways of navigating life, you need to be able to put words to feelings. And so, one of the biggest things that we find for people is not just that they're feeling a challenging emotion, it's that they can't name and understand it. And so, this is a big thing that I want to do with all of us is to help understand how different emotions look. Because it's only when we can actually understand different emotions and how they're different from each other that we can really get at what's going on and then look at going back to this word again, looking back to the narratives of how we are feeling that way and why we are feeling that way and how we can change feeling that way if we don't like it. Or if we do like it, how we can create more opportunities as well, right? So in this, a big important thing to think about is what sort of emotions are dominant in your human experience? Are you somebody who often feels a particular set of emotions or one or two in particular that you can name? And then thinking about, as I put in point three there, like which ones are we giving power to? And by this, what I really mean is like, which emotions do we feel okay with and which ones do we not feel okay with? There is shame within emotions, and we'll talk a lot about shame as well over this month and next month because it's a crucially important thing to understand and a massive factor in things like depression and suicidal thoughts. Um, what emotions are we giving power to? Which emotions are we giving permission to? And which emotions are we pretending don't exist? So we'll spend some time on that as well. Okay, so this goes back to that one that had the roadmap that you saw when I was talking about Brené's different categories. These are some of the ones that fit exactly or fit into the groupings. We'll use this and we'll do an activity, but you don't need to worry about it too much. You can have a little look and see what kind of things are on there. If you do want to have a look right now, I would suggest seeing if you can identify um, emotions that are generally thought of as positive and emotions that are generally thought of as negative, and when you notice them in the same box together, really breaking away from this idea that similar groups of emotions will either all be good or all be bad. They'll have something else in common, and it won't be their goodness. Okay. So the goal for us and the goal for people generally looking at emotions is going to be able to understand how our emotions are affecting us, recognize whether that's a helpful feeling for us, whether or not we want to make changes to that, and to be able to accept that we're feeling it even when we don't like it. Some of the most some of the most mentally tough people are the ones that feel no less sadness or frustration or disappointment or guilt than anyone else, but they're able to sit in that emotion and understand what it's telling them without needing to pretend it doesn't exist. That is the shortcoming of most human beings. If we were to put it down to just like one thing, it's that when we find ourselves facing emotions we don't like, we like to pretend they don't exist. So we talk about this accepting emotions without judgment. We're going to try a little class activity. I'm hoping somebody might volunteer to do it with me. I promise I'll keep it straightforward when we get there, and you won't have to share anything too personal. And then just to wrap up, this will be something that we'll do as kind of a joining activity from our class going into the following week. So there's I don't know like I don't know if assignment is the right word, but a little activity that you'll take home where you're basically going to analyze an emotion and an event. I should say you're going to analyze an event that you felt sometime in the last couple of years, something of significance, something that you're okay with potentially sharing. So find that sweet spot between both being important to you, but also not feeling like you're oversharing, because I don't want anyone to be in that place. Um, and that line will be different for everybody. You can find it for yourself. But you're going to essentially analyze an event and look at the emotion, what we also call a secondary emotion, what other emotions were similar but aren't correct, using some of Brené's language um, and groupings. And then we're going to bring that for discussion on the following week. And that wraps up. It's a bit shorter. It's about 10 minutes shorter than the last one. Hopefully this was helpful. And if you have any questions, remember, you can always ask. You can bring them up in class. You can post them on the teams as well. Thanks so much. See you in class.